Welcome. I'm Matt Mayer, and this is the Mayoral Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be discussing the Second Amendment. There's a lot of talking points around the Second Amendment currently, and there's a few points of contention that I'm going to be focusing on in this episode. So first, I'm going to read the Second Amendment aloud. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So militia is really one of the few areas where people are taking issue with, especially in a lot of discussions that have been happening lately with regards to limiting the Second Amendment any further than it already is limited. So I think it's really important to realize that throughout time, words change, and the word militia is not the same meaning today as it was in 1791 when the Bill of Rights was ratified. So it's important to keep that in mind when interpreting not only this piece of legislation, but all legislation, to have the context of how it was written and the time in which it was written in mind. In the Declaration of Independence, there were 27 total grievances. One of those grievances against King George was the keeping of the military in the colonies at times of peace. This is important to illustrate how they felt about the defense of a country. They thought it was wrong to tax citizens for a standing army in times of peace. So keep that in mind when you're hearing the argument, rather, that the militia meant specifically something to defend the state. Now, there's a lot of people that are saying that now exists in the form of the National Guard, which didn't exist before, or the State National Guard. You have to really keep in mind how the founders would have felt about a standing military and a standing militia today. A lot has changed in the past 230 years since the passing of the Bill of Rights, but these men who wrote the Constitution and framed the Constitution stood against tyranny. They fought the strongest army in the world to create a country that stood against government overreach. So now we have a National Guard. If the military state that we have now existed in 1791 at the ratification of the Second Amendment, you have to ask yourself, how would the founders feel about restructuring the Bill of Rights and the Constitution? Would they change anything? Just think about how the military is funded today. The government does two things. One, they withhold our taxes, which is certainly a different mode of taxation than existed back in 1791. Taxes had to be collected. Now they can just be withheld. So I think that the founders, who had a problem with the taxation of people to fund a military during times of peace, would probably have an issue with that system as well. But not only do they withhold our taxes, which is a different system than before, they create debt. Currently, the government money is backed by nothing more than its own credit, and credit which they issue. So if the founders came back today and had to rewrite the Constitution based on the changes that has taken place in the world in the last 230 years, they would certainly rewrite the Constitution, but further limiting gun rights or removing the Second Amendment altogether in favor of a 100% police state for the safety and security of all citizens is not something that they would have considered in the slightest. The founders would certainly be appalled by the current financial system that we have in place, but that's a story for another day. The founding fathers were true students of history. They knew what caused nations to fall into tyranny. Disarming all citizens and outsourcing all personal protection to the state is a hallmark of tyranny, and they would have stood completely in opposition to that. So yes, if they were alive today, they would certainly consider removing the word militia from the Second Amendment, but they would not be eliminating the right to keep and bear arms. I guarantee you that. In other words, the men who created the Constitution and the greatest nation this world has ever seen, in the name of defying tyranny, fought a war to be free from that tyranny by separating the American people from their oppressors, would never disarm their citizens to make it virtually impossible for the future generations to accomplish the exact feat that they had just accomplished, should they find themselves in a similar situation as the founders did prior to July 4th, 1776. So the next point of contention within the Second Amendment is the right to keep and bear arms. I'm going to play a very brief clip of Joe Biden addressing that very issue.
The Second Amendment, from the day it was passed, limited the type of people who could own a gun and what type of weapon you could own. you couldn't buy cannon. Those who say the blood of patriots, and all the stuff about how we're going to have to move against the government.
So in that video, Biden talks about how it was illegal to own a cannon, but he fails to mention that a cannon is not something that an individual can bear. As I mentioned earlier, context when interpreting legislation matters. To bear something is to be able to support the weight of, and no one can support the weight of a cannon. And an arm being something that you can equip yourself with. So that's why it's important to actually take in the context in which it was written. You cannot support the weight of an arm that you cannot bear, therefore it's not covered by the Second Amendment. Part of the genius of the Second Amendment was it not being specific about the arms people can carry. Those in favor of gun control take a simple approach and say that muskets were the arm that was legal at the time, so that's what it meant to be able to keep and bear arms. However, this could have been written in the 8th century and could be applicable in the 18th century and would still allow for citizens to keep up with the times. The founders were students of history, as I mentioned before. They knew that the most powerful arm at the time was the musket, but that was not going to be the most powerful arm moving forward. Therefore, they left the language vague to keep it open for the inevitable changes in technology. In other words, the musket being the most powerful arm at the time and being legal means the amendment was written in favor of citizens being able to keep up with the advancing firearms. They knew if they wrote the word musket in 1791, just as if they had retroactively formed the United States and wrote the Second Amendment in 791 and wrote the word sword instead of arm, the amendment would be useless for those people in short order. They kept the term arm open to be able to be relative to the time. In my last episode, I spoke about the biggest issue around supporting the ban of semi-automatic rifles, or as they're commonly referred to as assault weapons. And that is to either greatly reduce or eliminate the deaths from mass shootings. As I covered then, but we'll briefly recap right now, the numbers of people who die every year in mass shootings in America is 114 people per year, and that's according to Michael Bloomberg's everytown.org. So, put that into context. Again, one of the things that we don't do very well as people is scale things. This is maybe not going to help us scale it, but it's going to be able to give us a frame of reference to how unlikely it is that somebody dies in a mass shooting. 270 people per year are struck by lightning, meaning you are 2.5 times more likely to be struck by lightning than die in a mass shooting in America. Generally, forming public policy for something this unlikely will eventually lead to government overreach. In their own research at everytown.org, they state that 25% of mass shooting deaths are caused by semi-automatic rifles, or what they would classify as assault weapons. So if semi-automatic rifles were banned in the name of ending mass shootings, and the reduction was even 50%, which would be double 25% based on their own research, 75 deaths would be stopped. In a country of 335 million, 75 is an extremely low number. And if the ban was accomplished and those deaths were actually prevented, would people even realize that those deaths were prevented? It's such a low number, I'm guessing that it would not be but a blip on the radar. I'm guessing that calls for the complete overturning of the Second Amendment would shortly follow any type of extensive assault weapon bans if that were to take place. Another argument against the Second Amendment, more specifically the semi-automatic rifles, is that you need to have an army to take on the United States. Citizens having semi-automatic rifles to overthrow a tyrannical government wouldn't matter in these people's opinion. So here's another clip of Joe Biden saying basically that.
Well, the tree of liberty is not water with the blood of patriots. What's happened is that there never been, if you wanted to think you need to have weapons to take on the government, you need F-15s and maybe some nuclear weapons. The point is that there's always been the ability to rationally limit the type of weapon that can be owned and who can own it.
So in that clip, Joe is correct and he's incorrect. For foreign powers to take on the United States, they need fighter jets and they need nukes. But for its own citizens to take on the government that is becoming tyrannical, it's going to take much less. I'm going to play a clip from 2022, and afterwards I'm going to explain it. Please pay attention to the country in this clip, as it's very important.
On September 16th, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died after being detained for allegedly violating Iran's laws requiring women to wear a headscarf. Iranian authorities say she died of illness, but her family said she fell into a coma after being mistreated by police. Protests sparked by her death have since rallied groups across Iran's society, from ethnic minorities to school children and even oil workers. According to human rights groups, clashes with police have killed more than 200 people. But despite the crackdowns and widespread internet shutdowns, videos have continued to emerge, showing how unrest has spread beyond women's rights to a movement that is calling for an end to strict theocratic rule. These demonstrations have now turned into the most broadly supported movement in Iran in more than 4 decades.
Okay, so in that clip, you see people of Iran protesting against an unjust killing of one of its young citizens. In the clip, you hear the narrator say that over 200 people have been killed. In order to quell the unrest, Iran did not use fighter jets. They did not use nukes. The reason is because they don't have to. Think about it. How did Nazi Germany do it? How did the Soviet Union do it? How is North Korea currently doing it? They did it by force, never having to use bombs on their own citizens, because they never had to, since their citizens could not properly defend themselves. When you outsource all of your security to someone else or something else, like the government, you're really just outsourcing power and the potential for violence to those who do not have your best interests at heart. If you don't think it could happen to the United States, think again, because it certainly can. And I'll talk more about that in my next episode. That is it for this episode of the Mayoral Podcast. Please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and share. It takes only a matter of seconds, and it'll help me grow the channel. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you on the next episode.